sometimes a person can be so successful, so rich, even so smart, that they actually, ironically, are not very smart in certain areas. They lack common sense. They're not able to relate to the common person. In other words, with the, crazy success that people can have, it can just lead them to be completely out of touch, unable to relate to other people and their struggles. And it's one thing to not be able to relate to the common person, and it's another thing to actually say something out loud in an interview on a podcast that is, well, quite out of touch and very much something that's worth laughing at. Now, this comes from an industry veteran named Chris Deering. He is a 79-year-old man who has worked for a lot of big tech companies, mainly Sony. For a decade, from 1995 to 2005, he was actually the president of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, and for 2 years, from 2003 to 2005, he was actually the president of 2 different sections of Sony. So this added on Sony Electronics Europe. And before that, he was vice president of international marketing for Atari. And after Sony, he was a board director of Codemasters, which is a subsidiary of EA. That lasted until 2010. So since 2010, for the past 14 years now, he has been a board member for a lot of different tech groups and tech businesses. Now, our friend Chris here was just on an episode of the My Perfect Console podcast, and they talked about the recent layoffs that have been happening in the video game development atmosphere over the past 3 years now, basically since 2021. I'm sure you know about this, but yeah, a lot of people have lost their jobs recently due to a lot of layoffs. So he was touching on this, and, well, he just made the most out-of-touch response literally anyone could have made here. So he talked a lot about this, and I have to say, I just have to give him the benefit of the doubt and just bring up the possibility that maybe this was worded in a way that it was worded very poorly, and maybe what he meant was actually to express optimism here. Maybe he meant well for people, but he just said it in the worst, word scramble ever. I don't really know what his intentions were here, but what he said was just awful, very out of touch. So he said that game developers who have lost their jobs should get over it. He said that people also who have lost their jobs due to the pandemic should drive an Uber, or even, and this is my favorite part, they should go to the beach for a year while they, I guess, wait for the gaming industry to bounce back. Yeah, the average game developer who's married with 2 or 3 kids, who probably lives paycheck to paycheck, wanting to just buy groceries and put a roof over their family's head. I'm sure they would have loved to have just had this advice, years ago when they lost their job. I mean, it's so simple. I mean, come on, you're an idiot if you don't think about it. Just, don't work for a year. Just go to the beach, kick your feet up, and relax. I mean, come on. Chris Deering does it. I mean, he's rich. I mean, come on, just live like him, go to the beach, kick your feet up, and all your problems are solved. I don't even need to explain how or why this is a brain-dead take on this. This is an embarrassing take, just flat out, to have as a former president of Sony. I mean, to have these thoughts in your head, that's one thing. And I think some of what he said was not crazy. It would seem that, again, maybe he was trying to make some sort of a point that was more than just this. He even said at one point, quote, "I don't think it's fair to say that the resulting layoffs have been driven by greed." And he's referring to corporate greed. He said, "I always try to avoid rapidly expanding staff because I anticipated there would be cycles of downturns." And he also talked about how these layoffs are kind of just the result of less revenue from recent games, and how game companies don't want to invest in these developers if they're getting less revenue overall. That's not a crazy take. I mean, you could kind of dissect it and criticize it, sure, but that is not insane. I do get what he's saying. He's maybe trying to say that, no, maybe it's not corporate greed. Maybe it's just, poor decision making by some management. Yeah, that makes sense. You can make that argument. But to say that all of your problems are going to go away as a developer by just, retiring temporarily for a year, that's not the way to get that point across. That is incredibly dumb, and to think that everybody can just have that luxury to take a year off of work is completely brain dead. It shows how out of touch he is. I think I've said that statement 5 times so far, but I cannot emphasize it enough how out of touch this guy is. This was a completely tone-deaf statement by a big tech bigwig that was trying hilariously to relate to the little guy and trying to understand where they're coming from. And this resulted in him offering advice that is completely unrealistic to anybody that has bills to pay and needs a job constantly for that to happen. It's one thing for this to come from some random person on the internet, but it's another thing to come from Chris Deering, an industry veteran, once a huge person at Sony. Yeah, Sony, by the way, recently announced a reduction of about 8% of its workforce, and they even closed their London studio. Yeah, it's been tough in the gaming industry recently with layoffs, and Sony has been no stranger to this. I think, me personally, I think it's good that Chris Deering isn't working at Sony anymore. It is concerning to think that once he was a very big person at Sony, he once had a lot of power there. I'm sure there are a lot of CEOs and executives that are this out of touch, but to be so bold, I guess I'll call it, as to say this publicly on a podcast, to me, I think that shows a complete lack of people skills, something that you really need as an executive. Like I said, Chris is now just a board member on a lot of different game studios and groups, so I think his days at Sony and Atari and big tech companies are over. I think he'll likely be spending the remainder of his years on a beach, probably for more than a year. It just makes me think how many big tech CEOs and executives there are that think like this.